Edward Theodore Gein, also known as the Butcher of Plainfield or the Plainfield Ghoul, was an American murderer and body snatcher. Gein's crimes, committed around his hometown of Plainfield, Wisconsin, gathered widespread notoriety in 1957 after authorities discovered that he had exhumed corpses from local graveyards and fashioned trophies and keepsakes from their bones and skin. Gein also confessed to killing 2 women, tavern owner Mary Hogan, in 1954, and hardware store owner Bernice Worden, in 1957. Gein was initially found unfit to stand trial and confined to a mental health facility. By 1968, he was judged competent to stand trial. He was found guilty of the murder of Worden, but he was found legally insane and was remanded to a psychiatric institution. He died at Mendota Mental Health Institute from respiratory failure, on July 26, 1984, aged 77. He is buried next to his family in the Plainfield Cemetery, in a now unmarked grave. Early life. Childhood. Gein was born in La Crosse, Wisconsin, on August 27, 1906, the second of 2 boys of George Philip Gein and Augusta Wilhelmine Gein. Gein had an elder brother, Henry George Gein. Augusta was fervently religious, and nominally Lutheran. She preached to her sons about the innate immorality of the world, the evil of drinking, and her belief that all women were naturally promiscuous and instruments of the devil. She reserved time every afternoon to read to them from the Bible, usually selecting verses from the Old Testament and the Book of Revelation concerning death, murder, and divine retribution. She hated her husband, an alcoholic who was unable to keep a job. He had worked at various times as a carpenter, tanner, and insurance salesman. During his time in La Crosse, George owned a local grocery shop, but he soon sold the business and left the city with his family to live in isolation on a 155-acre farm in the town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, which became the Gein family's permanent residence. Augusta took advantage of the farm's isolation by turning away outsiders who could have influenced her sons. Gein left the farm only to attend school. Outside of school, Gein spent most of his time doing chores on the farm. Gein was shy, and classmates and teachers remembered him as having strange mannerisms, such as seemingly random laughter, as if he were laughing at his own personal jokes. To make matters worse, Augusta punished him whenever he tried to make friends. Despite his poor social development, Gein did fairly well in school, particularly in reading. Deaths in immediate family. On April 1, 1940, Ed Gein's father George died of heart failure caused by his alcoholism, at age 66. Henry and Ed began doing odd jobs around town to help cover living expenses. The brothers were generally considered reliable and honest by residents of the community. While both worked as handymen, Ed also frequently babysat for neighbors. He enjoyed babysitting, seeming to relate more easily to children than adults. Henry began dating a divorced mother of 2 and planned to move in with her. He worried about his brother's attachment to their mother and often spoke ill of her around Ed, who responded with shock and hurt. On May 16, 1944, Henry and Ed were burning away marsh vegetation on the property. The fire got out of control, drawing the attention of the local fire department. By the end of the day, the fire having been extinguished and the firefighters gone, Ed reported his brother missing. With lanterns and flashlights, a search party searched for Henry, whose dead body was found lying face down. Apparently, he had been dead for some time, and it appeared that the cause of death was heart failure since he had not been burned or injured otherwise. It was later reported, by biographer Harold Schechter, that Henry had bruises on his head. The police dismissed the possibility of foul play and the county coroner later officially listed asphyxiation as the cause of death. The authorities accepted the accident theory, but no official investigation was conducted and an autopsy was not performed. Questioning Ed Gein about the death of Bernice Worden in 1957, state investigator Joe Wilimowski brought up questions about Henry's death. George W. Arndt, who studied the case, wrote that, in retrospect, it was possible and likely that Henry's death was the Cain and Abel aspect of this case. Gein and his mother were now alone. Augusta had a paralyzing stroke shortly after Henry's death, and Gein devoted himself to taking care of her. Sometime in 1945, Gein later recounted, his mother and he visited a man named Smith, who lived nearby, to purchase straw. According to Gein, Augusta witnessed Smith beating a dog. A woman inside the Smith home came outside and yelled for him to stop, but Smith beat the dog to death. Augusta was extremely upset by this scene. However, what bothered her did not appear to be the brutality toward the dog but, rather, the presence of the woman. Augusta told Ed that the woman was not married to Smith and so had no business being there, and angrily called her Smith's harlot. She had a second stroke soon after, and her health deteriorated rapidly. She died on December 29, 1945, at the age of 67. Ed was devastated by her death. In the words of author Harold Schechter, he had lost his only friend and one true love. And he was absolutely alone in the world. Work. Gein held on to the farm and earned money from odd jobs. He boarded up rooms used by his mother, including the upstairs, downstairs parlor, and living room, leaving them untouched. While the rest of the house became increasingly squalid, these rooms remained pristine. Gein lived thereafter in a small room next to the kitchen. Around this time, he became interested in reading pulp magazines and adventure stories, particularly those involving cannibals or Nazi atrocities. Gein was a handyman and received a farm subsidy from the federal government starting in 1951. He occasionally worked for the local municipal road crew and crop threshing crews in the area. Sometime between 1946 and 1956, he also sold an 80-acre parcel of land that his brother Henry had owned. Crimes. On the morning of November 16, 1957, Plainfield hardware store owner Bernice Worden disappeared. A Plainfield resident reported that the hardware store's truck had been driven out from the rear of the building at around 9:30 a.m. The hardware store saw few customers the entire day. Some area residents believed that this was because of deer hunting season. Bernice Worden's son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Worden, entered the store around 5 p.m. to find the store's cash register open and blood stains on the floor. Frank Worden told investigators that on the evening before his mother's disappearance, Gein had been in the store, and that he was to have returned the next morning for a gallon of antifreeze. A sales slip for a gallon of antifreeze was the last receipt written by Worden on the morning that she disappeared. On the evening of the same day, Gein was arrested at a West Plainfield grocery store, and the Waushara County Sheriff's Department searched the Gein farm. A Waushara County Sheriff's deputy discovered Worden's decapitated body in a shed on Gein's property, hung upside down by her legs with a crossbar at her ankles and ropes at her wrists. The torso was dressed out like a deer. She had been shot with a .22 caliber rifle, and the mutilations were made after her death. Searching the house, authorities found whole human bones and fragments, a wastebasket made of human skin covering several chair seats, skulls on his bedposts, female skulls, some with the tops sawn off, bowls made from human skulls, a corset made from a female torso skinned from shoulders to waist, leggings made from human leg skin, masks made from the skin of female heads, Mary Hogan's face mask in a paper bag, Mary Hogan's skull in a box, Bernice Worden's entire head in a burlap sack, Bernice Worden's heart in a plastic bag in front of Gein's potbelly stove, 9 vulvae in a shoe box. A young girl's dress and the vulvas of 2 females judged to have been about 15 years old. A belt made from female human nipples. 4 noses. A pair of lips on a window shade drawstring. A lampshade made from the skin of a human face. Fingernails from female fingers. These artifacts were photographed at the State Crime Laboratory and then decently disposed of. When questioned, Gein told investigators that between 1947 and 1952, that he made as many as 40 nocturnal visits to 3 local graveyards to exhume recently buried bodies while he was in a daze-like state. On about 30 of those visits, he said that he came out of the daze while in the cemetery, left the grave in good order, and returned home empty-handed. On the other occasions, he dug up the graves of recently buried middle-aged women he thought resembled his mother and took the bodies home, where he tanned their skins to make his paraphernalia. Gein admitted to stealing from 9 graves from local cemeteries and led investigators to their locations. Alan Wilimowski of the State Crime Laboratory participated in opening 3 test graves identified by Gein. The caskets were inside wooden boxes, the top boards ran crossways. The tops of the boxes were about 2 feet below the surface in sandy soil. Gein had robbed the graves soon after the funerals while the graves were not completed. The test graves were exhumed because authorities were uncertain as to whether the slight Gein was capable of single-handedly digging up a grave during a single evening. They were found as Gein described. 2 of the exhumed graves were found empty. 1 casket was empty, 1 casket Gein had failed to open when he lost his pry bar, and most of the body was gone from the 3rd grave. Yet Gein had returned rings and some body parts. Thus, Gein's confession was largely corroborated. Soon after his mother's death, Gein began to create a woman suit so that he could become his mother to literally crawl into her skin. Gein denied having sex with the bodies he exhumed, explaining, "They smelled too bad." During State Crime Laboratory interrogation, Gein also admitted to the shooting death of Mary Hogan, a tavern owner missing since 1954 whose head was found in his house, but he later denied memory of details of her death. A 16-year-old youth, whose parents were friends of Gein and who attended ball games and movies with him, reported that Gein kept shrunken heads in his house, which Gein had described as relics from the Philippines, sent by a cousin who had served on the islands during World War II. Upon investigation by the police, these were determined to be human facial skins, carefully peeled from corpses and used by Gein as masks. Gein was also considered a suspect in several other unsolved cases in Wisconsin, including the 1953 disappearance of Evelyn Hartley, a La Crosse babysitter, and Georgia Weckler, an 8-year-old who disappeared in 1947. On the evening of October 24, 1953, Evelyn was watching a 20-month-old girl at the residence of Viggo Rasmussen, a professor at La Crosse State College. That day, her father called multiple times but never received a response. He visited the Rasmussens' home to inquire about his daughter after growing concerned. The lights and radio were on, and Evelyn's father discovered the doors to the house locked. There was no sign of Evelyn, but the infant was unhurt and asleep in her crib. The living room's furniture was jumbled, and Evelyn's textbooks were strewn about. On the floor of the living room were one of her shoes and her broken spectacles. In the basement, her other shoe was discovered. With the exception of a basement window in the back of the house, all the windows in the house were locked. That window's removed screen was resting up against the exterior wall. The Rasmussens' tiny stepladder, which they had been using to assist with painting the basement, was set up at the window. Pry marks were visible on 3 more windows. Footprints from a pair of sneakers could be seen in the living room and the basement window box. A considerable amount of Evelyn's type blood was found both within the house next to the basement window and outside in the yard, in addition to the signs of forced entry. The yard had 2 blood puddles, one of which was 18 inches in diameter. There was a bloody handprint about 4 feet off the ground on the wall of a garage 100 feet from the Rasmussens' home, and stains on the home of a neighbor's house. The kidnapper stopped and rested Evelyn on the ground twice, according to authorities, after carrying or dragging her through the yard. Following Evelyn's scent for 2 blocks, the tracking dogs lost the scent at Cooley Drive, which is northeast of the Rasmussen residence. Authorities thought whoever abducted her drove off with her in a car. Amateur sleuths have noted a resemblance to Evelyn Hartley's abduction and the attempted kidnapping of Judy Rodenkel. Judy Rodenkel was a 16-year-old high school student of Auroraville, Wisconsin, located 10 miles west of Oshkosh. On the morning of October 30, 1956, Judy left home for where her school bus would pick her up, but she never made it to school. It was not until evening when her boyfriend arrived at the Rodenkels' house to take her out on a date that anyone realized something was wrong. Judy's socks and handkerchief were found on a bridge near Mill Pond a mile north of her home. Bloodhounds were brought to the creek, but they could not track her beyond the bridge. On November 2 at 7:30 p.m., Farmer Edgar Tim found Judy, alive, barefoot, cold and unconscious in a shack on his property. She woke up in a state of shock and was taken to a hospital and released after about a week. Afterward, she could not account for her actions over the course of those missing 3 days. Doctors suggested that she had suffered a blackout. It has been long speculated that she was almost abducted by the same person who abducted Hartley, but that she might have escaped. The local police never did any follow-up and closed the case. The identity of Rodenkel's abductor has never been determined. Auroraville was only 33 miles east of Plainfield. At around 3:30 p.m. on May 1, 1947, Georgia Jean Weckler vanished from the area around her farmhouse in rural Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin. She was a 3rd grader at Oakland Center School when a neighbor picked her up and left her off at the beginning of the half-mile driveway going up to her house. Georgia suggested to her neighbor that before returning home, she might go into the woods and get some flowers for a May Day basket. Georgia was observed by the next-door neighbor gathering a sizable bundle of letters from her family's mailbox and beginning to go up the driveway, but she never made it to her home. The mail she was holding when she vanished has never been found, and she has never been heard from again. Witnesses claimed to have seen a dark-colored, maybe black, 1936 Ford car with 4 doors in the area that afternoon. It had a gray plastic spotlight. Deep tire marks were later discovered on the road, suggesting that a vehicle had pulled away quickly. The car disappeared at the same moment Georgia did. Gein owned a black 1937 Ford. After his arrest, murderer Ed Gein was considered a suspect in Evelyn's disappearance, as he was visiting a relative a few blocks away from the Rasmussen house at the time. However, Gein denied involvement in the disappearance and passed 2 lie detector tests. Police found no trace of Evelyn's remains during a search of Gein's Plainfield property. In November 1957, authorities announced that Gein had been cleared of any connection with the disappearances of both Evelyn Hartley and Georgia Weckler. Despite this, some still consider Gein a suspect. Gein has also been linked to the unsolved double disappearance of Victor Bunk Travis and Ray Burgess. On November 1, 1950, 43-year-old farmer, Victor Travis, a resident of Adams County, just west of Plainfield, said goodbye to his young wife of just 2 months and went off to hunt deer in the company of a Milwaukee acquaintance named Ray Burgess. At some point in the late afternoon, the two stopped for beers at Mac's Bar in Plainfield for several hours of drinking and chatting. At around 7 p.m., they both left the bar, got into Burgess's car and drove away. That was the last time anyone ever saw them. The 2 hunters, along with the car Burgess was driving, simply disappeared. Thousands of acres of wilderness were explored in search of Travis and Burgess, but no trace of them was ever found. This case was one of several cases linked to Ed Gein in the book, Deranged, by Harold Schechter. In addition, he had been tentatively linked to the June 1954 disappearance of 32-year-old neighbor, James Walsh, and the August 1956 disappearance of 30-year-old Irene Keating. During questioning, Washoe County Sheriff Art Sly reportedly assaulted Gein by banging his head and face into a brick wall. As a result, Gein's initial confession was ruled inadmissible. Sly died of heart failure at age 43 in 1968 before Gein's trial. Many who knew Sly said he was traumatized by the horror of Gein's crimes, and this, along with the fear of having to testify, caused his death. One of his friends said, he was a victim of Ed Gein as surely as if he had butchered him. Trial. On November 21, 1957, Gein was arraigned on one count of first-degree murder in Washoe County Court, where he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Gein was diagnosed with schizophrenia and found mentally incompetent, thus unfit for trial. He was sent to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, a maximum security facility in Waupun, Wisconsin, and later transferred to the Mendota State Hospital in Madison, Wisconsin. In 1968, doctors determined Gein was mentally able to confer with counsel and participate in his defense. The trial began on November 7, 1968, and lasted 1 week. A psychiatrist testified that Gein had told him that he did not know whether the killing of Bernice Worden was intentional or accidental. Gein had told him that while he examined a gun in Worden's store, the gun went off, killing Worden. Gein testified that after trying to load a bullet into the rifle, it discharged. He said he had not aimed the rifle at Worden, and did not remember anything else that happened that morning. At the request of the defense, Gein's trial was held without a jury, with Judge Robert H. Golmar presiding. Gein was found guilty by Golmar on November 14. A second trial dealt with Gein's sanity. After testimony by doctors for the prosecution and defense, Golmar ruled Gein not guilty by reason of insanity and ordered him committed to Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. Gein spent the rest of his life in a mental hospital. Judge Golmar wrote, due to prohibitive costs, Gein was tried for only one murder, that of Mrs. Worden. He also admitted to killing Mary Hogan. Fate of Gein's property. Gein's house and 195-acre property were appraised at $4,700. His possessions were scheduled to be auctioned on March 30, 1958. Amidst rumors that the house and the land it stood on might become a tourist attraction. Early on the morning of March 20, the house was destroyed by fire. A deputy fire marshal reported that a garbage fire had been set 75 feet from the house by a cleaning crew who were given the task of disposing of refuse, that hot coals were recovered from the spot of the bonfire, but that the fire did not spread along the ground from that location to the house. Arson was suspected, but the cause of the fire was never officially determined. It is possible that the fire was not considered a matter of urgency by Fire Chief Frank Worden, son of Bernice Worden, Gein's last victim. When Gein learned of the incident while in detention, he shrugged and said, "Just as well." Gein's 1949 Ford sedan, which he used to haul the bodies of his victims, was sold at public auction for $760 to Carnival sideshow operator Bunny Gibbons. Gibbons charged carnival goers 25 cents admission to see it. Death. Gein died at the Mendota Mental Health Institute due to respiratory failure secondary to lung cancer on July 26, 1984, at the age of 77. Over the years, souvenir seekers chipped pieces from his gravestone at the Plainfield Cemetery, until the stone itself was stolen in 2000. It was recovered in June 2001, near Seattle, Washington, and was placed in storage at the Washoe County Sheriff's Department. The gravesite itself is now unmarked, but not unknown, Gein is interred between his parents and brother in the cemetery. In popular culture, Gein's story has had a lasting effect on American popular culture as evident by its numerous appearances in film, music, and literature. The tale first came to widespread public attention in the fictionalized version presented by Robert Bloch in his 1959 suspense novel Psycho. In addition to Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 film of Bloch's novel, Psycho, as well as a movie about this film's production, entitled Hitchcock, Gein's story was loosely adapted into numerous films, including Deranged, In the Light of the Moon, Ed Gein, The Butcher of Plainfield, Ed Gein, the musical, and the Rob Zombie film's House of 1000 Corpses and its sequel, The Devil's Rejects. Gein served as the inspiration for myriad fictional serial killers, most notably Norman Bates, Leatherface, Buffalo Bill, and the character Dr. Oliver Threadson in the TV series American Horror Story, Asylum. The song Young God from the Swans EP of the same name is told from Gein's perspective. American filmmaker Errol Morris and German filmmaker Werner Herzog attempted unsuccessfully to collaborate on a film project about Gein from 1975 to 1976. Morris interviewed Gein several times and ended up spending almost a year in Plainfield interviewing dozens of locals. The pair planned secretly to exhume Gein's mother from her grave to test a theory, but never followed through on the scheme and eventually ended their collaboration. The aborted project was described in a 1989 New Yorker profile of Morris. The character Patrick Bateman, in the 1991 novel American Psycho and its 2000 film adaptation, mistakenly attributes a quote by Edmund Kemper to Gein, saying, "You know what Ed Gein said about women? He said, when I see a pretty girl walking down the street, I think two things. One part of me wants to take her out, talk to her, be real nice and sweet and treat her right, what her head would look like on a stick." In 2012, German director Jörg Buttgereit wrote and directed a stage play about the case of Gein called Kann I Bail und Lieb at Theater Dortmund in Germany. The part of Gein was played by actor Uwe Robeck. At the time, the news reports of Gein's crimes spawned a subgenre of black humor, called Geiners. Since the 1950s, Gein has frequently been exploited by transgressive art or shock rock, often without association with his life or crimes beyond the shock value of his name. Examples of this include the song titled Dead Skin Mask from Slayer's album Seasons in the Abyss, Nothing to Gain from Mudvayne's album LD50, Ed Gein, from the Ziggins album Rusty Never Sleeps, and Skinned, from Blind Melon's album Soup. The Slayer song features a young girl pleading with Gein to release her, although Gein never held a live captive and his victims were middle-aged women. Bradley Mark Brad Stewart, bassist for alternative metal band Marilyn Manson, was known by his stage name Gidget Gein, inspired in part by Gein. There was also a band named Ed Gein. In 2022, Ed Gein was featured in an episode of Netflix's Dahmer, Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story as a possible inspiration for Dahmer. However, a direct connection between the two is seen as speculation. See also: grave robbery, body snatching, Anatoly Moskvin General, list of homicides in Wisconsin, list of serial killers in the United States.